Good morning. Morning, morning, morning. As you know, we're in a series looking at the 7 I am statements of Jesus. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus gives us 7 statements that sort of unveil his heart to us, revealing to us a unique perspective of who Jesus is. This morning we get to look at a really interesting one where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And this is such an important statement for us because we live in a world with all kinds of intensity, with all kinds of loss, with all kinds of death, with all kinds of uncertainty. I think one of the greatest struggles we have as Christians is knowing how do we work through the really hard and the difficult moments of life where it feels like the bottom just falls out. How do we work through these things in a way that is authentic and reflects the reality of what we are going through, but also the unique reality of the trust and the hope that we have in Jesus and the life that he brings to us? And how do we bring together these two things that we feel so intensely and so difficultly sometimes as we journey out in life with Jesus? And today Jesus gives us a unique perspective on this as we engage with him in John chapter 11. Let's pray. Father, today we thank you that you are great, that you are lovely, that you are merciful and glorious. We thank you, Lord, that you desire to bring us deeper and further into life, into goodness, and into your fullness. Would you help us today to recognize how we can faithfully grieve the losses that we have, and also to know the hope and the life that you bring to us. We thank you that in all circumstances, in all situations of life, that you are gloriously present with us. Will you continue to lead us and to guide us, to make us who you want us to be, and empower us to follow you in all things. And in the midst of this morning, Lord, in my weakness, would you be strong? Would your presence be seen? Would we come to know you and exalt you more? In Jesus' name, amen. So do you have a great group of friends? Is there a few people that you just really love being with? And whenever you're with them, it just feels like you're home. It feels like you're exactly where you should be. They're the kind of people you just seek to spend as much time with as you possibly can. And whenever you're with them, it's always a long conversation over a meal and just a really good long visit. Jesus also had these people in his life. A particular family, 3 siblings named Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And whenever he was in the Jerusalem area, he would always stay with them. He would spend time at their house out in Bethany, which was just a short journey away from Jerusalem. And there's a sense of camaraderie, this deep sense of connection between Jesus and these people. And one day as he was off ministering in another place, Jesus got word from these 2 sisters that said, Lord, the one that you love is sick. And they're sending Jesus word saying, you need to come now. This is not going well. We need your presence here right now. We need you to do what only you can do in Lazarus' life and bring things the way that we know that they should be. And Jesus, out of a deep and profound sense of love and compassion for them, waits another couple of days and then says to his disciples, let's go back. Let's head towards Bethany. But when Jesus arrives in Bethany, he is confronted by death. He finds that Lazarus has already been dead and buried in a tomb for 4 days already by the time that Jesus arrives there, which means he probably died very, very soon after the messenger left to go and to find Jesus. And he sees this deep sense of pain, this deep sense of loss. It's the kind of situation for Jesus and for his friends where the bottom has simply just fallen out, where all of their world has just been shaken and nothing seems like it was just a few days before. And in the culture at that time, when someone would pass away, friends and family members and all kinds of loved ones would gather around and they would spend a full week in mourning. They would spend a full week just weeping and crying and processing this loss together. And so they're 4 days into this process when Jesus arrives. And someone goes to Martha and tells her that Jesus is waiting for her just outside of town and wants to connect with her and meet with her privately. So Martha gets up, she heads out, she goes to see Jesus, and they have this amazing conversation together. Lord, Martha says to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. It's an amazing statement at the beginning. I think about how many times I've said, and I'm sure how many times you have said something very similar. In the moments of our life where there's hardness or pain or difficulty, so often this is exactly our response. We go to Jesus and our first words are, if you had done this wouldn't have happened. It's the reality, it's the natural cry of our heart in those spaces, just to say, Lord, this is not how I want it to be. Why is it this way? But even in the midst of her doubt and her pain and her uncertainty, she still chooses to trust Jesus, saying to him, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again at the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Then Martha heads off to go and find her sister Mary and bring her out to have another private conversation with Jesus. But as soon as Mary gets up, everyone gathered around assumes that she's headed off to the tomb. And so this whole crowd of people comes together with Mary, and they find Jesus on the outsides of town. And again, they have the same conversation. We read, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved and troubled in spirit. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. When we look at this passage, there is so much sorrow, there is so much pain, there's such a deep and an intense sense of loss. We see this for these two sisters, their overwhelming response, and I'm sure they've had this conversation together, saying, Lord, if you had just been here, Lord, if you had just dealt with this situation differently, we wouldn't be in this moment of loss. We wouldn't be in this huge sense of disorientation where all of life just seems like it's falling apart. And Jesus sees the whole community around them gathered together, weeping in this deep, deep sense of loss. And Jesus' reaction to all of this is quite interesting. The NIV translates this for us. Jesus deeply moved in spirit and troubled, but it doesn't quite cover the linguistic range of the wording that's used here. The wording that's used here would describe a deep sense of this guttural kind of frustration and anger, this deep sense of intensity in Jesus' response. Jesus isn't sort of just troubled. There's this deep, overwhelming sense of righteous anger in Jesus. As he sees this experience and watches all of this loss, there's this deep sense of anger that just wells up in the depths of his soul. And certainly Jesus is not angry with Mary and Martha. Certainly Jesus is not angry with all the people mourning, or he would have instructed them to do something differently. And scholars will tell us that Jesus' deep and profound anger is an anger towards death. It's an anger towards loss. It's an anger towards all of the suffering and all of the injustice and all of the hurt, all of the scarring that is left on the humanity created in Jesus' own image. There's this profound, this deep, this guttural kind of anger that this is the way the world is. And so Jesus enters right in with them, into the midst of their loss, into the midst of their weeping, into the midst of their mourning, and he dignifies this process of grief. He dignifies this experience of saying, we just need to get this out. We just need to weep this experience through. We just need to understand and confront this death. We need to recognize the intensity of this loss, and we need to do this together. And I don't have to convince you that this is also a part of our own experience. We all know what this looks like to grieve a loss. I think about in my own experience, the intensity of losing someone that I loved. And then for days and weeks after, just a really hard reality where you sometimes catch yourself thinking about the person. You need to tell them about something, or you need to remind them of something, or wouldn't they like this story? And then it hits you all over again and you feel overwhelmingly foolish. How could I not remember that they have died? And you feel a sense of guilt about that. You feel just dumb for not remembering. And the grief of the loss just hits you all over again. We feel this sense of loss. We understand what this grief looks like. But we also grieve many different kinds of losses. Certainly there is the loss in physical death, but there's also the loss in the death of our dreams, the death of our hopes. There's the loss in the death of maybe our reputation or our innocence or our perspective, or those moments when we realize that things will never be as we thought they would be, when something seems lost and broken forever. In all of those kinds of moments, there's a profound sense of grief. There's a profound sense of loss. And these are also legitimate losses that need to be grieved. This passage points out to us that it is important to grieve our losses with Jesus. That Jesus understands this deep, this guttural kind of frustration and anger that we live in a world that is so broken, that is so marred. In this place where there is suffering and there is all this kinds of intensity and loss. But I think as Christians, quite often we feel like we need to stuff our grief. We need to pretend that it's not there. Sometimes this comes to us from various things that have been said to us over time. Maybe someone said to you when you were younger, men don't cry, or stop being that overly emotional woman, or good Christians don't grieve in this kind of way because we certainly have hope. And while it's true that we certainly have hope in Jesus, Jesus dignifies this process of grief. He recognizes the reality that it is simply true that we need to grieve the losses that we have, whatever those losses may be. Author and writer Rob Reimer, who wrote the Soul Care course that we go through here, made this statement: "You must process your pain and your grief so that for your soul to be healthy. If you trap these emotions inside, the problem isn't just that you have negative emotions like anger, but your positive emotions close down as well. You feel less joy, you feel less love, you feel less peace. You may start to engage in comfort sins to help you cope with the internal pain that you are not acknowledging." I think for many of us, what happens in life is that we have been shut down either by ourselves or by someone else in some of our moments of grief, in some of these spaces of loss. And some of the issues that we're currently struggling with and currently experiencing are simply a result of the fact that we have never been able or free to actually grieve the losses that we have experienced. And again, Jesus invites us to take these losses to Him, to find ways to grieve the pain that we go through. He dignifies this process by weeping with us, by entering right in with us into our pain and our suffering, our grief, and all of our uncertainty. And as we go through this journey, sometimes it looks like a deep and a joyful sense of confidence in Jesus. And sometimes it looks like an absolute broken disaster. And both of these things are a legitimate expression of grief. Both of these things are a legitimate expression of faith in Jesus as we move forward with Him. Because the most dangerous thing that we can do in a moment of loss or a moment of grief is to take offense at Jesus. So often temptation will come and whisper in our ears at our moments of loss, "You should be angry with God because He hasn't done what you want." And in that moment we can choose to separate ourselves from God and simply become angry or bitter towards Him. We can take offense at Him for the ways He hasn't done things the way that we want them to go. And as soon as we do that, we begin to separate ourselves from the only source of hope or compassion or life or light or resurrection. And in these moments, it's desperately important that we cling to Jesus, that we hold on to Him with everything that we are and with everything that we have, and that we legitimately and honestly bring to Him the grief that we so certainly feel. And the book of Psalms is a really beautiful example of this. Throughout the book of Psalms, we have this huge range of emotional expression. And it gives us permission to grieve and to weep and to feel a deep sense of loss. And it keeps moving us forward to continue to trust Jesus in all of our losses. It gives us words of comfort and compassion and confidence, and also words to express our loss and our uncertainty. As we find ourselves in various moments or seasons where there is simply loss, or it feels like the bottom is falling out of our life, the book of Psalms can once again be a huge strength to us. Something to give words to the things that we feel deep down that we're not sure how to express, or we don't know if they are appropriate to express to God. And so first and foremost, it is essential that we confront death, that we grieve our losses faithfully and well, and that we cling to Jesus through that process, even as we grieve. But even more importantly than this, in these moments of darkness and our moments of our uncertainty, we also need to find life. We need to come to Jesus for the goodness and the beauty, the wonder of what He and He alone can bring to us. Because as Jesus entered this passage and this particular situation, everything changed and everything changed forever. We continue reading on. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," He said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there will be a bad odor. He's been in the tomb for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you have sent me." When He had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped in strips of linen and cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off his grave clothes and let him go." Lazarus is deeply, profoundly, and truly dead. He is so very dead that Martha says to him, "Don't you dare open the tomb. It's just going to be gross. This has been long enough. He is dead enough that we cannot do this. This is a very bad idea." And even though she's just said, "Jesus, I believe in who you are," she cannot even comprehend the reality that Jesus could bring life and hope and dignity and a powerful transformation into this experience that she is facing. She cannot even comprehend that this could happen. But wherever Jesus is present, there is hope and there is life. There's something beautiful and deep and new. And as Jesus looked at this situation, Jesus is master and Lord over all things. He has authority over absolutely everything. His authority extends all the way through, even to death. And as Jesus commands, death itself must let Lazarus go. It must allow him to come back and to experience life all over again. He has complete authority, and he says this. You can imagine the profound joy in Jesus' experience when his friend walks back out of the tomb. You can imagine Jesus running to him and just hugging him and enjoying Lazarus once again. You can imagine the huge shift that this makes in the lives of these two sisters. There is hope, real and tangible. Everything has just changed. Everything is just new. Everything is just different. Because Jesus has spoken and life has come back. Death has been fully overcome. Jesus has brought this life into this space. In Jesus, our own experience also can be radically changed. As we know Jesus and as we are found in him, death no longer has hold over us. Even as we think about the reality of our own physical deaths, it radically changes. It is completely different forever and ever and ever. One author has said that in Jesus, death simply is change. So that death is no longer a destination. It is simply a transition. Death for us becomes not something that we fear or dread or that is overwhelming. Death is simply one way to pass from the presence of Jesus here and now into the fullness of the presence of Jesus forever and ever and ever. And we know that on the other side, we will experience just the beauty and the life and the glory of the living God. I remember a number of years ago, I spent some time with a friend of mine who was diagnosed with cancer. And as we walked through that really intense process of the last few days of the journey, I remember sitting with her in palliative care as we're trying to process the intensity of what's going on. I started to say to her, "How do you feel about what's coming?" And for a long time, she just said to me, "I don't want to talk about it. I just don't want to talk about it. It's just too hard. It's too scary. It's too intense. I don't want to talk about it." And a couple of days before she passed away, she had a dream about Jesus. Jesus appearing to her, showing up to bring her to himself. And as soon as she had that experience, everything changed. The fear was completely gone. She felt a deep sense of confidence, a profound sense of contentment and readiness. And in the last few moments of her life, as her daughter sat beside her, they were talking, and she was kind of in that space where it's just very hard and difficult. And she whispered to her mom, "Mom, do you see Jesus?" And she just nodded, and then she just moved straight. Whew. Sorry, it's a couple weeks in a row. It's an emotional space. She moved just gently from this life into the fullness, the beauty of Jesus' presence in the next. I think about the story of my grandmother. As she was passing away, she was talking about seeing Jesus and all of her loved ones coming straight towards her. And then as she reached out for them, she just again beautifully, seamlessly passed from this life into the very next one. And this is the beauty of who Jesus is, that this great, this dreaded, this fearful reality of death is transformed simply into one more transition as we just move seamlessly into the presence and the life of Jesus, as he carries us and holds us and moves us. This is the power of Jesus to radically transform death and make it something completely different. And so it gives you and I hope, even as we go through hard and difficult situations, as we age, as we get a bad diagnosis, as we work through whatever that might look like. We move towards death not as a dreaded enemy, not as something to be feared or run from at all costs, but simply as one more transition. One more transition to the glory and the goodness of the presence of God. Knowing that one day, when Jesus himself returns, all of us will be raised up to live fully embodied once again, for all of eternity with Jesus and with one another. This is the beauty of what Jesus does. This is the way that he radically transforms death. And in all of our losses, and all of those things that we need to grieve, Jesus himself can bring life. even into spaces that seem so very dark and so very dead, even into all the spaces where we cannot ever imagine how something good could come out of these spaces. Jesus can bring life. He brings life into all those spaces where we feel like we cannot imagine how the next thing could be good. Sometimes we grieve a transition in our life, and there's something hard that we need to set aside and grieve as we move through that process. We realize that Jesus does something different and brings a different kind of life and hope and peace and joy and delight in the very next season. And sometimes he actually just restores it and just raises back to life dreams or hopes or desires that we've had. I remember in 2010 being here and feeling that God was placing a profound calling on my life to be the senior pastor of this church. And in 2010, I felt this profoundly, I was confidently convinced of this. And then it didn't happen. And I remember thinking, okay, what do I do with that? How do I process this sense of loss? The sense that I really felt like this is what was going to happen and it didn't come to be. I had to grieve the sense of the loss of that dream. And then God did work in my life and a lot of other situations and spaces, and somehow in 2016, I came back in this particular role. And again, Jesus just brought resurrection. He just brought life back into a dream that I thought was dead and done and finished and gone. And for some of us, this is what he wants to do. There are dreams and hopes and desires and passions that we have that we think are dead and done and gone. And Jesus wants to breathe new life into those things. He wants to restore them back to us. And sometimes it happens like this. It's just a very clear resurrection. And sometimes it's a powerful work of redemption, where Jesus takes something, even something hard or painful and difficult, and he redeems it and gives us something beautiful and life-giving out of it. This has been an interesting week. And I remember last week as I shared some of my own story and the pain involved with what that looked like. I've been contemplating again the reality of thinking through that I couldn't have imagined something good coming out of that experience. It's been interesting as a few of you have talked to me in the last while about the idea of how God used that in your life to help you to feel that you could trust him with what you were currently going through. It's been an amazing affirmation for me, just again of the beauty of how God can take even the worst moments of our lives and he can bring a resurrection. He can bring something fresh and new and life-giving. He can bring hope or peace or help, even out of the hardest moments of all that we have gone through and all that we've experienced. Because this is the beauty of what Jesus does. He calls life even out of moments of death. He renews all things, and there's absolutely nothing beyond the scope of his redemptive power. And one day, every single one of us are going to see that all of our tragedies have simply been overcome, reversed by the beauty and the life and the goodness and the power of Jesus. One day we will see that his love and his compassion have been so much greater, and death itself will simply die, never ever to be heard from again, where there will be no more sense of loss or uncertainty or pain or anguish as we work through these things. And so what are the deaths that you've experienced? Or what are the deaths that you're currently experiencing? In all of these spaces, God calls us to do two things that sometimes seem so contradictory. First of all, we need to confront death. And we also need to find life. We need that healthy space of grief to be able to process what we are legitimately losing in the presence of God. To choose to not take offense at God at the moments where we are frustrated and hurt, but to cling to him desperately in those moments and to find his compassion and his strength and his help for whatever it is that we may be facing. And then even from that, he calls us also to find life, to look for a resurrection, to trust him with those moments that seem dark or uncertain or difficult, to process with him all of our losses or our grief or our pain or the ways that we have encountered death, and to allow his goodness and his love and the truth of his resurrection life to wash over every part of who we are. We need to experience the grace and mercy of Jesus in all of these things. I know personally, as I said, it's been an interesting week for me. There's been some things going on in sort of the wider circle of my loved ones that have been tremendously hard and painful. As I've been preparing for this week, again, Jesus has been saying to me over and over and over again, you need to trust me. You need to grieve these losses with me. And you need to look with me for resurrection and hope and help and strength. Where do you need that this morning? Where do you need to just legitimately grieve some losses? And where do you need Jesus to breathe a fresh sense of hope and life and strength into your soul? We want to take a few moments now with Jesus just to hear from him and to process whatever it is that we need to with him. Let's take some time now. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? Today we know the beautiful reality, the overwhelming truth that death has been overcome and fully defeated, that we are free to grieve our loss as well, and to find a profound sense of joy and delight and hope and life and freedom in the presence of God, because this is who he is. And today he continues to invite us to celebrate the reality and the goodness of these truths. Amen.